Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning into today's episode of Armchair Gaming. I'm your host, Sheldon Goodrich, also known as the Unbearable Gamer, and today we're taking another look at Fortnite Battle Royale. I apologize about that. I know what you're thinking, Fortnite Battle Royale again, how pedestrian, Sheldon, but we got into it on the last episode, and I really wanted to expand and explore on some of the topics that I touched on, but didn't really elaborate on too much, and those happened towards the end of the last episode, so if you don't know what I'm talking about, check that out, and come back over to this episode, I guess. But I mentioned a couple of things, like a problem of language, creating issues of sensory perception, and as well as Cogito Ergo Sum, the famous expression by Rene Descartes, I think therefore I am, or more adequately translated, thought therefore existence. And I was hoping we could talk about those today. And since Fortnite was the game that brought those conversations to light for me, I figure we may as well continue the conversation in that direction. So, playing some more Fortnite Battle Royale, I fared maybe a little bit better, but also infinitely worse than last time, which is good. And we'll open up by I guess kind of recapping last episode. Last episode we were talking about Battle Royale and the real you, and we dealt with sensory perception. And a little bit of humanity, because there's something about Battle Royales that kind of contraindicate the principle of mankind being a loving, caring creature. We certainly have loving, caring tendencies, but ultimately, like every other creature, with or without a moral compass, violence appears to be an inevitability in some regards, because we have some inherent reason to propagate and survive. We need to be better than others so that we can propagate ourselves into the future. But when we continued through that episode and we looked at the possibility that nobody else except you exists, which is kind of an interesting theory. I enjoy it. The whole proposition that you don't actually exist seems kind of terrifying, or other people doesn't exist seems kind of terrifying. It truly is an absurdist statement, but it's one that you need to grapple with if you're going to be in the rings of philosophy. As this was an upsetting first death. I had a jetpack. I thought I was going to do well. I did not. But when we're dealing with sensory perception, we have to remember that there is a veil between quote unquote self and reality, and that's covered by most religious principles. When you're looking at things, I guess in modern Western thinking, there is this duality of man and spirit, and so you're more than just your body. You're more than just a series of chemical reactions and neurons firing to create that which is you, which is kind of a comforting notion, I would think. But it's also tackled in Eastern philosophies as well. Like when you look at when you look at the pillars of Hinduism, or you look at different forms of Buddhism, there's either duality or a monality, or a lack of person or lack of self. Like principles like I'm gonna butcher this with Brahma and Mana, which is like one with Brahma, very loosely and fairly translated, because I've certainly forgotten that pronunciation. Is essentially saying that we're all the same thing. We're all of Brahma. And when we look at yoga, especially in the Yoga Sutras, it isn't a duality of individuals. It's there's supposed to be a trinity of sorts, a triality, plurality. We'll go with the word plurality. There is man, there's nature, there's mind, and there's Perusa, which is the self or person. And those are important distinctions when you're reading the Yoga Sutra, because the whole intent of yoga is to make nature, which is a combination of the mind and nature itself, reflect your morally perfect self, your Perusa, so your Perusa can escape the cycle of reincarnation, and attain capital Yeah, which is isolation. Obviously, we're getting into a little bit of a tangent there, but I just wanted to express the idea that that dualities, in a theological sense, exist in many fronts, but they can exist in a far more basic principle, which I touched on last episode when we were dealing with the idea of there being a veil or a lens/camera between you and reality. And it feels kind of weird to say that, because some people would believe that like what you perceive is reality, but it's just as possible. That's terrible to say. Obviously, we know that there's an a classic philosophical principle that we are just homunculi operating machines, and obviously they're very fleshy machines, because when I poke my computer screen, nothing happens, but when I poke somebody, there's give and there's a sense of flesh. And those are two examples of sensory perception. That I'm trying to think of the best way to phrase this, but that sensory perception is an important driving factor in how we interact with things. But it is largely a third party transaction. We'll go back to Rene Descartes. Rene Descartes wasn't the nicest of people to animals, as were not very many people in ancient times and classical times. He is known for abusing cats and dogs to prove that they're in fact not living creatures; they're just machines, which is a horrible way to think. But I think inherently, obviously, I believe him to be wrong, but he was doing it to prove a point, and that point is that animals don't feel, perceive, or think the same way that he or I does. I admonished Descartes for several reasons, not the least of which is his inability to bolster himself against the Catholic Church, because when push came to shove, he decided to be a big old sock and give in to their demands that God be a part of his equations or he be excommunicated, which I suppose in those times also could have involved being murdered. But he kowtowed and caved into the church and added God to his cycle in his treatise in order to demonstrate the principle of Cogito Ergo Sum. Oh, I'm so bad. I am inarguably the worst at this game. I mean, this guy is definitely just sat there swinging away and died. I'm assuming that was like a small child who has never played the game before, otherwise I would have died there. But there is this when we look at his meditations, Rene Descartes goes, he wants to prove that nothing exists, or that nothing outside of him exists, and he boils it down to what we know as I think therefore I am, or more commonly Cogito Ergo Sum, which is thought therefore existence, and that principle just is designed to indicate or to demonstrate the idea that if a thinking thing is a real thing, but you can't know what you are beyond a thinking thing. So when we look at duality of mind and body, or mind and spirit, or mind and whatever it is that makes you happy, that duality presents itself as I am a thinking thing inside of a body, and the body is what perceives thing, and then it transmits information to it transmits sensory data to, pardon me, the thinking thing or the self, and it makes things difficult or complicated, because are you the thinking thing and your body, or are you just the thinking thing, or are you just a body? And I think it's important. Hashtag dead. So when we're looking at this principle of duality, I obviously don't have an answer, which is why I'm rambling as much as I am. But when you're talking about duality, there's this really difficult it's really difficult to come to a conclusion, because As I've said, and like I think this is maybe the more important thing, is that perception, the fact that there is perception and a mechanism behind perception that we can't emulate when we're discussing like a person-to-person basis, it becomes near impossible for us to talk about others in real relatable terms. And this may be one of the reasons why mankind is inherently and strangely counterproductive and violent all the time, is because there is this lens that when we interact with somebody that we have to interact with them through, and when we receive data from them, it's always received through this lens. So if I assume that you exist, if I assume that you exist and you truly do exist to something other than sensory data that I perceive on a metaphysical level, there's always going to be a translation issue of what you say and how you say it relative to how I interpret it, because not only do you present the information in a uniquely you way, I receive the data in a uniquely me way, trying to understand the uniquely you way. I realize that has very little to do with Fortnite, but that was one of the things that was brought up yesterday on the last episode, so I wanted to continue the Fortnite ramble. The other thing I talked about was Cogito Ergo Sum in itself, but that was the end of the episode, and I started off with the problem of language, so I think I've covered both of those guys a little bit. Oh, not really. Let's talk about language. Let's end today's episode talking about language and how it's complicated. Obviously, like, perceiving language is a part of being a thinking thing. But presenting language is also a thing, because like when we hear language, obviously the first thing we think about is speech, because that is a really powerful thing that humankind has, or a really powerful tool that humankind has used and evolved from. And if I were playing Fortnite teams, I'd be able to demonstrate like how powerful language through verbal communication is, because you can use that to coordinate your team in a significant number of ways. But communication happens in a variety of ways as well. There's non-verbal communication, like body language and things like that. As I've mentioned in this episode already, language is the byproduct of two distinct entities. There is a receiver and there is a sender and there's a receiver, right? Obviously that's a very like narrowed down, and it's intentionally narrow understanding of language, because obviously there's much more to it. When you're looking at language, you could be looking at you could be looking at like how a radio broadcaster produces language, or a written author produces language, or an artist produces language, because art is also a form of language. It's all non-verbal communication. That's an example of non-verbal communication. But the issue with language as it's presented through video games in a wide variety of ways is when somebody receives a puzzle, one might say that the puzzle is not a form of communication, but sometimes the misinterpretation of the data that's presented is on part of both parties involved. The developers produced a puzzle that is complicated and mundane and dry, or it's not mundane, dry, complicated, convoluted, and unnecessarily difficult. And I suppose the other trade-off would be something along the lines of the person playing the game doesn't have the capacity to understand the puzzle, or they're missing a part of the puzzle itself, right? Like, if you're playing a game and you happen to have, like, you use a guide for one section of the game and you forget you don't learn a mechanism about the game, it becomes critical later on in life. You suffer for it later. Actually, a really good example of that from my own childhood is actually from Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask, the first round, for the N64. Shortly after its release, to pick it up. Legend of Zelda is, by a wide margin, my favorite game series. But there is a puzzle in Snowhead Mountains, the temple, where as you play as a Goron, when you can punch icy blocks in, they'll travel great distances. I couldn't for the life of me figure that puzzle out, and I was a docile child. Obviously threw temper tantrums, as most of us do. I wasn't like the chillest of chill children, but I was also relatively like docile, and I blame my sisters for that because they always beat me up. But that's a tangent for another day. I didn't for the life of me think to punch that those blue columns that didn't match the rest of them. And I got angry and I stopped playing that game for about a month until I saw a guide, and this was back before the internet was prevalent, and I didn't have internet at home, so I couldn't just go online and look stuff up. So I remember picking a guide up at a Walmart, and being like, "Oh, easy," and that was a lack of communication between the video game and myself, or I shouldn't say a lack, but a miscommunication between the video game and myself, because the game gave me all the information, but didn't present it well enough for my small child brain to figure that out. This day and age, I'm usually pretty good about finding puzzles out. I love puzzles across the board. But yeah, when we're dealing with the problem of language, that's what we're looking at. Language is a tough thing. And when you're playing games, it kind of comes out in multiple ways. Where the information is presented to you by the developers. Is it presented in a way that's clear, concise, and understood? When they present nonverbal cues, are you capable of understanding them? And does information, however you want to qualify or quantify the information, does it get presented in a way that is efficient? And then again, when you're playing multiplayer games, like had I been playing Fortnite with teams, how efficient am I in receiving information from the game, translating it in my brain, and presenting it to my teammates in such a way that we can be the most efficient team that we are. And that's a tough one. I think language is a really fun thing to talk about, especially in video game terms, because video games are a culmination of many, many different forms of communication, both audiological, visual, verbal, and nonverbal. There's so many different ways to look at video games as a form of language, and I think even more interesting is the amount of language that comes out of video games in regular speech, regardless of language. There's a continual evolution of language and how language is non-static. Video games, both the developers and the players, participate in a form of always evolving language. And I think it's if nothing else, is really neat to look at. Because there's this presentation of language. I should have pulled the trigger on this guy. I probably could have hit him. I'm just a big baby. Yeah, there's this fascinating evolution of language, and it's not all positive, obviously. It takes one garbage individual to make life difficult for everybody. But generally speaking, video game language is non-hostile and non-confrontational. It's complicated. It's a complicated machine. And that's really all there is to it on that one. I shouldn't say that. We'll hopefully talk about language again in another episode where language plays a more important role. Because again, we're playing Fortnite, and I'm playing Fortnite solo, so the language doesn't matter that much. Obviously, there are things we talked about, like picking up cues from other players, and when they see me, when they don't see me, etc., etc. But those are language is probably saved for another game where the presentation of language, or the absence of language, makes for a more compelling case. So that's going to wrap it up for today's video. Thanks everybody for coming and hanging out and listening to today's episode of Armchair Gaming. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to the Scholarly Gamers YouTube channel. And don't forget to check us out on Twitter, Facebook, and our website, scholarlygamers.com. So thanks so much for tuning in, and have a wonderful day.